The dust devils danced their perpetual waltz across the dry creek homestead, painting the worn clapboard house a perpetual ochre. Hank Rollins, weathered like the ancient cottonwood by the creek bed, watched them from the porch, his good eye squinting against the New Mexico sun. It was 1881, but for Hank, some days it felt like 1865, the year the war ended. The sounds of distant cicadas morphed into phantom screams, the smell of parched earth into the coppery tang of battlefield mud. His hands, gnarled and scarred, often drifted to the empty space where his sidearm used to hang during his days as a cavalry scout. He had traded the saddle for the plow, the rifle for the shovel, but the ghosts of his past rode with him still. The ranch, a paltry inheritance, sagged under the weight of neglect and the relentless drought. It had once been a prosperous spread, his father's pride, but now it was merely a tether to a world Hank often wished he could escape. His only companions were the skeletal outlines of his cattle, old Jack, his steadfast horse, and the constant, nagging voice of his conscience. He understood animals better than people, their simple needs and honest fears. They didn't ask questions, didn't whisper about the look in his eye, didn't remind him of the men he'd led to their demise, or the moment he'd turned his back on the carnage. Sagebrush Flats, the nearest town, was a testament to the uneasy calm that settled like a dust cloud over the frontier. Whispers slithered through its single street. Rumors of slick land deals, the encroaching railroad, and Sheriff Tobias Granger's increasingly heavy hand. Hank knew the type of men who twisted the law to serve their own pockets. He kept to himself, trading a few meager hides for supplies, avoiding eye contact, and hoping the town's growing unease wouldn't spill over onto his barren acres. He was more wolf than man these days, and content to stay that way. The journey to Sagebrush Flats was a rare concession for Hank, a break from the monotonous rhythm of patching fences and coaxing life from stubborn soil. His supplies were critically low, and even the self-sufficient rancher needed nails and flour. The town itself, usually a welcome respite of human chatter, felt choked. A palpable tension hung in the air, heavier than the dust kicked up by the solitary wagon. People moved with averted gazes, their low murmurs dying to whispers when he approached. He'd almost finished his meager shopping when the commotion started by the jailhouse. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim resignation. Sheriff Tobias Granger, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster, stood on the jail steps, his voice booming across the plaza. "Step right up, gentlemen. Fine, healthy stock for honorable work." Hank's blood ran cold. It was one of Granger's infamous vagrancy auctions, a cruel mockery of justice used to control the desperate and seize their meager holdings when they couldn't pay trumped-up fines. On the small auction block, trembling under the harsh gaze of the crowd, stood a woman, late 20s, her face smudged with dirt and tears, holding two wide-eyed children close. "Mary Whitlock," he heard someone mutter. Her children, Caleb and Anna, clung to her skirts, their small bodies rigid with fear. Granger's sneering smile, the casual cruelty in his eyes, twisted something ancient and raw inside Hank. He saw the helpless faces of soldiers he'd abandoned, the desperate pleas of men he'd failed. Without conscious thought, driven by a surge of guilt and a deep, ingrained sense of justice he rarely acknowledged, Hank's hand shot up. He rasped, his voice cutting through the hushed crowd. The bid was outrageous, more money than he could spare. Yet the words were out before he could recall them. A ripple of gasps and whispers spread through the townsfolk. A cold-hearted loner buying a woman and her kids like they were cattle. The ride back to Dry Creek Homestead was fraught with an unfamiliar tension. Hank drove the wagon, the silence thick and heavy, punctuated only by the creak of the wheels and the occasional sniffle from the children huddled in the back. Mary Whitlock sat rigidly beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, wary as a cornered coyote. He stole a glance at her, then at the children, Caleb, a boy whose eyes held a distant, haunted look beyond his years, and Anna, younger, pressing herself into her mother's side. He had bought them, but he didn't own them. The thought sat heavy in his gut. Establishing a semblance of normalcy was a trial. Mary moved through the small homestead like a ghost, performing assigned tasks with quiet efficiency, but offering nothing more. Her suspicion of Hank was a tangible thing, a wall between them built from hardship and disappointment. The children mirrored her wariness. Caleb, especially, kept his distance, his small face a mask of mistrust. One night, Hank awoke to fading hoofbeats and found Caleb's cot empty. He returned the boy before dawn, silent and grim, the attempt to escape a stark reminder of the fragile ground they stood on. The town, never welcoming, became actively hostile. News of his purchase spread like wildfire, painting him as a callous opportunist. Cattle buyers who once inquired about his meager herd now turned away, their wagons rumbling past his gate without a glance. The whispers gnawed at him. He tried to tell himself he didn't care what they thought, but the isolation deepened. Then came Granger's men, riding hard and mean. They claimed unpaid debts, vague violations, anything to justify their presence. They weren't looking for money. They were looking for trouble. During one such raid, a burly thug shoved Mary against the porch post, his eyes lingering on her with crude intent. Hank materialized, rifle in hand, his voice a low growl that sent the man recoiling. Mary looked at him then, a flicker of something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps surprise, in her tired eyes, before she gathered the children close. The day Mary tried to leave, the fear in Hank's stomach was colder than any winter chill. She'd packed what little they had, her resolve a stark line on her face. But as she stood by the gate, a rider galloped past, shouting about Granger's new edict. All uncultivated land near the proposed railroad line would be seized within the month. Mary froze, the words sinking in. Not just her land, but Hank's too. Granger wasn't just an opportunist. He was a land shark, and Hank's isolated homestead was prime picking. The realization shifted something in Mary. Her desperation to escape morphed into a grim determination. She began to see Hank not as her buyer, but as a fellow prisoner in Granger's web. Slow, halting conversations began, centered around the sheriff's escalating ambition and the precariousness of their situation. Hank, ever taciturn, found himself speaking more, explaining the intricacies of ranch life. He began teaching Caleb to ride old Jack, patiently guiding the boy's hands on the reins. Anna, drawn by the vibrant hues, was given a small patch of dirt to call her own, where she carefully planted wildflower seeds. These small acts, these shared vulnerabilities, began to chip away at the walls between them. Just as a fragile sense of understanding began to bloom, nature delivered a cruel blow. An early, deadly frost swept down from the San Juan Mountains, wilting their meager crops and threatening the last of Hank's cattle. Survival hinged on a dangerous cattle run to higher, unfrozen pastures. It was a desperate gamble. On the trail, the ambush came swift and brutal. Bounty hunters, not typical rustlers, burst from the scrub. One yelled, the lie ringing hollow against the sound of gunfire. It was a long, violent fight, Hank using his old rifle, Widowmaker, with practiced, deadly precision. He took a bullet in his side, the pain searing, but fought them off, the bounty hunters vanishing as quickly as they'd appeared. Lying wounded in the dust, the truth became chillingly clear. Granger wasn't just harassing him. He was trying to push him off the land, one way or another. While Hank lay healing, Mary tirelessly tended to his wound, the common purpose knitting them closer. One afternoon, while sorting through what few possessions she had left, she discovered something curious. An old, leather-bound Bible inherited from her husband. Tucked within its yellowed pages were faded documents, deeds, and brittle letters. As she read, her hands began to tremble. They weren't merely family heirlooms. They were proof that the Whitlock family technically owned a significant swath of land that mysteriously abutted the very route the railroad was projected to take. Land that Granger keenly wanted. The discovery ignited a fire within Mary, fueled by a terrible, dawning realization. The truth, when it came pouring out, was a torrent of sorrow and fury. Her husband hadn't simply disappeared. He had resisted Granger's attempts to buy their land dirt cheap. He had refused, and for that, he had been silenced. Her trauma, once a private agony, became a shared burden, a stark clarity that illuminated Granger's villainy. The memory of Caleb's accusation, "It's your fault, Pa's dead," now made terrible, heartbreaking sense. As Mary recounted her pain, a dam broke inside Hank. He saw his own guilt reflected in her eyes, the echoes of his past failures. His voice, rarely used for more than terse commands, became a low, halting confession. He spoke of the war, of leading men into skirmishes he knew were doomed, of the shame that washed over him when he deserted, unable to bear the weight of command he felt unworthy of. He wasn't a hero. He was a coward, haunted by the specter of those he'd failed. In that small, dimly lit cabin, two broken souls found solace in shared wounds. Their bond, forged in mutual suffering, hardened into a joint resolve. Survival was no longer enough. They would fight back. With Granger's ruthless ambition now exposed, they formed an unlikely alliance. Hank remembered Eli, his old wartime friend, a native tracker with eyes that missed nothing, and Sadie Burns, the saloon owner, shrewd and resourceful, a woman who held her own in a man's world and knew Sagebrush Flat's underbelly better than anyone. Together, they would gather evidence, chipping away at Granger's power, preparing for a reckoning that was as much about personal redemption as it was about justice. Founders Day. The irony was not lost on Hank as he rode toward Sagebrush Flats, the morning sun glinting off the widowmaker tied to his saddle. This was the day Granger planned to consolidate his power, to announce the Grand Railroad Pact that would cement his illicit gains. The town square buzzed with an artificial festivity. Families gathered, unaware of the corruption festering beneath the veneer of celebration. Hank dismounted old Jack, his right arm still aching from the bounty hunter's bullet, but his resolve burned bright. He walked with a noticeable limp toward the makeshift podium where Granger, flanked by his smirking deputies, was already beginning his self-congratulatory speech. The sheriff's voice, usually so booming, seemed to shrink as Hank, a gaunt, determined figure, approached the courthouse steps. Hank's voice, a raw rasp, cut through the speech. The crowd turned, murmuring in confusion. With a dramatic sweep of his good arm, Hank tossed a handful of documents onto the steps, official-looking land deeds, clearly showing the Whitlock family's rightful ownership, followed by falsified arrest warrants, including the one for his own fabricated horse theft. Finally, with a flourish, he produced Granger's own blood-stained sheriff's badge, which Eli had recovered during a discreet visit to the jailhouse. A stunned silence fell. Then, a murmur grew, fueled by Mary's clear, steady voice as she stepped forward, the Bible clutched in her hand, confirming the ancient land claims. Sadie, emerging from the saloon, began detailing illicit gambling rings and rigged land auctions, backed by Eli, who materialized, seemingly from the very shadows, his presence a silent, powerful endorsement of the truth. The townsfolk, long oppressed, began to rally, their fear giving way to a nascent anger. Granger, his face purpling, roared, "This is treason." But his deputies hesitated, glancing nervously at the growing, hostile crowd. A standoff. Suddenly, Granger drew his pistol, aiming at Mary. Hank, quicker than his injury suggested, shoved her aside, drawing his own revolver. A shot cracked the morning air. The duel was swift and brutal, a blur of motion and smoke in the middle of Main Street. Dust swirled, catching the sun, as the church bell began to toll, a mournful chime for justice delayed. Granger fell, a grim satisfaction settling on Hank's face, but not before a final, desperate shot found its mark, slamming into Hank's shoulder. The dust settled over Sagebrush Flats, heavy with more than just the residue of gunfire. Granger was dead, his reign of corruption ended by a man who had once sought only solitude. Hank, however, did not walk away unscathed. The bullet in his shoulder, while not fatal, robbed him of the full use of his left arm. It was a permanent mark, a reminder of the price of justice, but also a symbol of how far he'd come. With Granger gone, the railroad was forced to reassess its route, deterred by the sudden, inconvenient truth of the Whitlock family's land claim. Sagebrush Flats, previously choked by fear, began to breathe again. The town, in a surprising turn, elected Sadie Burns as their first honest sheriff, a testament to her quiet strength and unwavering integrity. Eli Mendoza, ever the silent guardian, became her deputy, his keen eyes and deep knowledge of the land a formidable asset. At the Dry Creek homestead, life slowly, purposefully rebuilt itself. Mary, now a co-owner, worked tirelessly alongside Hank, her strength and intelligence proving indispensable. The land, once barren under Hank's solitary care, began to respond to their combined efforts. The fear in Caleb's eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. He began schooling the younger children of Sagebrush Flats, sharing the knowledge Mary had once taught him, planting seeds of hope in a new generation. Anna, still captivated by nature's beauty, planted wildflowers over the old burial hill, a silent tribute to those lost, and a vibrant promise for the future. Years passed. The scars on the land healed, and the ranch prospered. Hank, his hair streaked with more gray, would often sit on the porch, watching the green fields stretch towards the mountains. He saw Caleb and Anna now, tall and strong, racing horses across the verdant pastures, their laughter echoing in the wind. The silence that once haunted him was now filled with the gentle hum of life. He had found his redemption not in escaping the past, but in facing it, in doing right by those who needed it most. He bore the weight of his guilt, but now it was balanced by the lightness of purpose, of belonging. The wound in Hank's side was a constant throb, a fiery reminder of the ambush. He lay on his cot, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, the fever sometimes blurring the lines between reality and the spectral memories that still haunted him. Mary, her face etched with exhaustion, but her movements precise and gentle, changed his dressings, her touch bringing a strange comfort he hadn't known in decades. It was during these quiet moments of recovery that Mary found the old Bible. It belonged to her husband's family, full of comforting passages and, as it turned out, far more. Tucked within its fragile pages were land deeds, legal documents penned in florid script detailing the ownership of a significant tract of land, her family's land. Land that, on further inspection, lay directly in the path of the proposed railroad right-of-way. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about preserving Hank's ranch anymore. It was about her history, her family's legacy. A cold dread settled in her stomach as the pieces clicked into place, forming a horrifying picture. Her husband, she realized, hadn't just died in some unfortunate accident. He'd been murdered. Murdered because he owned this land. Murdered because he'd refused to sell to the railroad baron working in concert with Granger. The truth was a bitter, searing poison. Her past wasn't an untended wound. It was a festering injustice orchestrated by the same man who had sold her on an auction block. The story poured out of her, raw and unfiltered, as Hank listened, his grim face softening with understanding. He saw the fire in her eyes, a reflection of a desire for retribution that mirrored his own. And then the dam broke for him too. The guilt that had been his constant companion for so many years resurfaced, forcing him to confront it. He spoke of the war, of the cavalry scouts he'd led into hopeless battles, of his own desertion, not from cowardice, he realized now, but from a crushing sense of responsibility and a desperate need to escape the carnage he felt he had caused. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the small cabin, a new resolve settled between them. They were not just victims. They were survivors, and now they would be fighters. They would expose Granger. They would reclaim what was theirs. The days blurred into weeks, marked by the slow mending of Hank's wounds and the even slower mending of frayed trust. Mary, now understanding the true depth of Granger's corruption and its direct impact on her family, became a fierce ally. She devoured the old documents from the Bible, cross-referencing them with maps Hank possessed. The truth was undeniable. Her family, the Whitlocks, held rightful claim to a significant parcel of land precisely where the new railroad proposed to lay its tracks. This was no coincidence. The revelation of her husband's murder, orchestrated by Granger to seize this land, was a raw, open wound, but it also fueled her resolve. She saw the threads connecting every hardship she'd endured since his death to the sheriff's greed. Her grief transformed into a cold, determined anger. Hank listened, his own past guilt echoing her pain. What he had confessed earlier, his wartime desertion, the men he felt he'd failed, now bound them in a shared vulnerability. Their burdens, once solitary and crushing, became a foundation for a powerful, desperate alliance. They knew they couldn't face Granger alone. Hank, relying on instincts honed from years surviving the frontier, thought of Eli Mendoza, his friend from the war. Eli, a native tracker, moved through the shadows of the territory like a whisper, invisible yet ever present. He would know what to look for, how to move against a man like Granger. Mary, though new to this fight, knew another ally. Sadie Burns, the sharp-witted saloon owner, commanded a different kind of respect in Sagebrush Flats. Sadie ran a business, yes, but she knew the town's secrets, its undercurrents, its fears. She had a network of ears and eyes, and a pragmatic sense of justice, even if she rarely spoke of it. Together, the four of them formed an unlikely council. In hushed tones, often under the cloak of night, they plotted. Eli, with his uncanny ability to gather information, began uncovering specific instances of Granger's land swindles, his fabricated arrest warrants, his threats. Sadie, through her unique position, heard the whispers of desperate townsfolk, those similarly exploited by Granger. They meticulously gathered evidence, building a case not just for Mary's land, but for the countless others robbed by the sheriff's tyranny. The pact was sealed not with words, but with a shared understanding born of suffering. Hank, Mary, Eli, and Sadie, four disparate souls united by the singular purpose of confronting Sheriff Tobias Granger. Their every action now coalesced around this shared objective. Training became Hank's singular focus, despite his lingering injury. He pushed himself, testing the limits of his mending arm, knowing the showdown would demand every ounce of his skill. He taught Mary to handle a rifle with steady hands, the Widowmaker a grim tutor. She learned quickly, her movements precise, fueled by a searing anger. Caleb, though not a direct combatant, absorbed every lesson Hank imparted on riding and tracking, his young eyes sharp, a silent promise of future guardianship. Eli, moving like a phantom, delved deeper into Granger's corrupt dealings. He brought back not just rumors, but hard facts, dates of fraudulent land sales, names of threatened ranchers, details of bribes exchanged with railroad men. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, reassuring anchor for Hank. Sadie, meanwhile, worked the town from the inside out. Through hushed conversations in the back rooms of her saloon, she unearthed stories of Granger's tyranny, chipping away at the fear that had long paralyzed Sagebrush Flats. She subtly fanned the embers of discontent, turning whispers into murmurs, murmurs into a growing rumble of public opinion. She gathered evidence of her own, ledgers detailing Granger's illicit protection rackets and rigged card games, all meticulously documented. Their alliance was a delicate tapestry, each thread essential. Hank provided the hardened resolve and combat expertise, Mary the moral clarity and intellectual backbone, Eli the silent intelligence and untraceable movements, and Sadie the vital connection to the pulse of the town. They were preparing for more than a gunfight. They were orchestrating a public unmasking. The pieces of their plan fell into place, silent and precise, like the intricate gears of a well-oiled machine. They watched Granger, unsuspecting, reveling in his perceived victory. They waited for the right moment, a time when the entire town would be witness to his downfall. The dusty winds of the New Mexico territory carried not just the scent of sagebrush, but also an undercurrent of hope now, a quiet promise of change. Hank, though permanently hindered by his arm, found a different kind of strength in shared labor. The Dry Creek homestead was no longer just his. It was theirs. Mary, with her sharp mind and tireless spirit, became the true co-owner, directing the ranch's rebuilding. Her former school teacher's meticulousness now applied to crops and livestock. The railroad, after a heated inquiry sparked by the collected evidence and Mary's rightful claim, was finally forced to reroute its tracks, bypassing the Whitlock land, and, by extension, rendering Granger's schemes moot. Justice had been served, not just for them, but for the town. Sagebrush Flats, truly liberated, took up the task of shaping its own future. Sadie Burns, a woman of unyielding integrity and sharp wit, was formally elected as the town's first honest sheriff. Her past as a saloon owner faded into irrelevance as her natural leadership shone through. Eli Mendoza, ever the silent and watchful presence, became her deputy, his knowledge of the land and its people invaluable. Together, they established a foundation of true law and order, built on fairness and respect, not corruption and fear. Life at the ranch, though still a struggle against the harsh land, was now imbued with purpose and joy. Caleb, freed from the crushing weight of his father's unfair death, blossomed. He devoured books, tutored by Mary, and then, in turn, began teaching other children in Sagebrush Flats, nurturing young minds with knowledge and stories, sowing seeds of a brighter future. Anna, too, found her calling. The small plot of dirt Hank had given her had once held only wildflowers. Now it blossomed with a vibrant array of colors, a living testament to healing and growth. She planted them not just for beauty, but for remembrance, tending to the flowers that now covered the old, forgotten burial hill, where others whose lives had been crushed by Granger's greed found a peaceful resting place. Years smoothed the rough edges of their past. Hank, older now, his face lined with the sun and wisdom, rarely spoke. But his gaze, as he watched Caleb and Anna, vibrant and alive, racing horses across the green fields of land they had fought so hard to reclaim, held a quiet contentment. The air in Sagebrush Flats hummed with an unusual energy. Founder's Day, a rare occasion for General Assembly, was upon them. Sheriff Tobias Granger, ever the showman, had planned a public address, a grandiose announcement of the railroad pact that would cement his illicit gains and legitimize his power. He stood on the courthouse steps, his chest puffed out, a practiced smile plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm about to break. Hank, still favoring his wounded arm, rode into town on Old Jack, his gaze fixed on the courthouse. He dismounted, and despite the pain, he walked with a slow, deliberate purpose toward the gathering crowd. Mary was already there, positioned subtly, her hand resting on Caleb's shoulder. Eli melted from the shadows on the edge of the plaza, his presence almost imperceptible, while Sadie stood by her saloon, watching, a glint of anticipation in her eyes. As Granger launched into his self-congratulatory speech, Hank cut him off. His voice resonated, raw and commanding, silencing the crowd. With a dramatic, almost theatrical gesture, Hank hurled a stack of documents onto the courthouse steps. Land deeds that clearly belonged to the Whitlocks, followed by fabricated arrest warrants, including his own. The papers fluttered, scattering like fall leaves. Finally, he produced Granger's own blood-stained sheriff's badge, a silent, damning piece of evidence Eli had retrieved. A wave of stunned silence rippled through the crowd. Mary stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, corroborating Hank's claims. Sadie, seizing the moment, began to recount Granger's various abuses, her words amplified by Ellie's silent, unwavering presence. The townsfolk, long oppressed by fear, began to stir, their whispers turning to murmurs of agreement, a collective anger simmering to the surface. Granger's face contorted in a mask of rage. "This is treason," he bellowed, drawing his pistol, but his deputies, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, hesitated. The standoff was taut, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Suddenly, Granger, in a desperate, final act of malice, aimed at Mary. Hank, despite his injury, reacted with a primal urgency, shoving her out of the way as he drew his own revolver. A shot cracked, followed by another. The duel was swift, brutal, and public, a reckoning played out in the dust of Main Street, witnessed by all. The church bell began to toll, a funeral peal for the fallen tyrant. Granger collapsed, but not before his final, desperate shot found its mark, slamming into Hank's shoulder. The very air in Sagebrush Flats vibrated with tension. It was Founder's Day, a celebration turned into a crucible. Sheriff Tobias Granger, oblivious to the meticulously laid trap, ascended the courthouse steps, prepared to announce the railroad pact that would seal his victory. But his triumphal speech was cut short. Hank Rollins, wounded but resolute, rode into the plaza on Old Jack. His presence alone, gaunt and determined, silenced the murmuring crowd. He dismounted, and though his left arm hung stiffly, he walked with an unyielding purpose toward the courthouse steps. The sight of him, a man so often the target of whisper and scorn, now commanding the attention of the entire town, shifted the balance. Hank's voice, raspy but clear, cut through the deceptive calm. With a dramatic flourish of his good arm, Hank tossed a handful of documents onto the steps. Legal deeds proving Mary Whitlock's family ownership of the coveted land, followed by counterfeit warrants, proof of Granger's manufactured crimes. Finally, with a grim flourish, he produced the sheriff's own blood-stained badge, a stark symbol of his corruption that Eli had discreetly recovered. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Mary, her courage unwavering, stepped forward, a Bible clutched in her hand, confirming the ancient land claims. Sadie, having emerged from her saloon, began to articulate the litany of Granger's abuses, her voice clear and cutting through the stunned silence. Eli materialized from the shadows, his silent, powerful presence lending an undeniable weight to their accusations. The townsfolk, finally emboldened, began to swell forward, murmurs of outrage replacing their long-held fear. Granger's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "Treason!" he roared, his hand instinctively going for his gun. But his deputies, sensing the volatile shift in public sentiment, hesitated. Realizing his control was crumbling, Granger's eyes narrowed, locked onto Mary, and he drew his pistol, aiming to silence the truth. In a blur of motion, Hank lunged, shoving Mary clear, simultaneously drawing his own firearm. A shot cracked the air, followed by another. The ensuing gunfight was brutal, personal, and swift, unfolding in the dusty center of Main Street. Every shot fired was a reckoning, a purging of past wrongs. The mournful toll of the church bell marked each bullet. Granger fell, irrevocably silenced, but not before his dying shot found its mark, slamming into Hank's wounded shoulder again. The scent of gunpowder slowly dissipated from Main Street, replaced by the murmurs of a town awakening from a long nightmare. Sheriff Tobias Granger lay dead, his reign of fear and corruption ended by a man who had chosen to stand. Hank Rollins, however, barely clinging to consciousness, bore the heavy cost. The bullet that had found his shoulder, a cruel echo of the earlier ambush, left him with permanent damage, robbing him of the full mobility of his left arm. It was a tangible scar, a constant reminder of the fight, but also a symbol of freedom earned. Life at Dry Creek Homestead, now officially co-owned by Mary Whitlock, slowly began to rebuild. Her strength, her innate intelligence, and her unwavering determination proved indispensable. She took on the bulk of the physical labor that Hank could no longer perform, guiding the ranch with a quiet competence that belied her previous life as a schoolteacher. The land, freed from the looming threat of railroad seizure, began to thrive under their shared care. Sagebrush Flats, too, began its own healing process. The railroad, facing irrefutable evidence of Granger's fraudulent land practices and the groundswell of righteous anger, was forced to divert its tracks. The town, empowered by its collective stand, appointed its first truly honest sheriff, Sadie Burns, whose savvy and moral flexibility had proved more valuable than any formal badge. Eli Mendoza, ever the silent and steadfast protector, assumed the role of her deputy, his presence a clear message that justice would now abide. Years bloomed across the valley like the wildflowers Anna planted. Caleb, having shed the burden of his father's tragic past, embraced a future of learning. He began teaching the other children of Sagebrush Flats, sharing the education Mary had instilled in him, ensuring that knowledge, not ignorance, would guide their community. Anna, now a vibrant young woman, continued her quiet work, planting wildflowers over the old burial hill where the forgotten victims of Granger's tyranny lay at peace. Her blooms were a vibrant testament to new beginnings, a silent promise to the future. Hank, older, his face etched with the lines of hard-won wisdom, would often sit on his porch, watching the changing seasons. He saw the children, grown and confident, racing their horses across the now green fields, their laughter carried on the wind. The haunted look in his eyes had mellowed, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. They say redemption comes on the wind, but sometimes it walks in quiet boots on a dusty road, beside widows, orphans, and men brave enough to start again. The dust settled over Sagebrush Flats, but a new wind had begun to blow. Granger's tyranny was over, and from the ashes of his corrupt rule, a fragile but determined community began to rebuild. Hank, though forever marked by the fight with a weakened arm, found a different kind of peace. The physical limitation was a constant reminder, not of failure, but of salvation, a testament to choices made and battles won. At the Dry Creek homestead, the concept of his ranch slowly transformed into theirs. Mary, now not just a resident but a true partner, poured her formidable intellect and resilience into the land. Her background as a teacher shifted seamlessly into managing the logistics of a working ranch, her keen eyes missing nothing, her organizational skills proving invaluable. Together, they coaxed life from the arid soil, their shared efforts a quiet defiance against the harshness of the frontier. Sagebrush Flats, freed from Granger's iron fist, started to chart its own course. The railroad, its plans for a direct route now irrevocably altered by the unearthed truths of the Whitlock land claim, was forced to reroute. The town, galvanized by the public showdown, democratically elected their first honest sheriff, Sadie Burns. Her street smarts and moral compass, once hidden beneath a veneer of saloon-keeper pragmatism, now shone bright. Eli Mendoza, ever watchful and fiercely loyal, became her deputy, his deep understanding of the land and its people providing an invaluable foundation for their new brand of justice. Years flowed like the creek, no longer dry. Caleb, no longer burdened by the guilt of his father's past, blossomed. He began schooling the younger children of Sagebrush Flats, sharing the knowledge Mary had instilled in him, cultivating not just minds, but hope. Anna, vibrant and hopeful, found solace and purpose in the earth. Her hands, once small and trembling, now carefully planted wildflowers over the old, forgotten burial hill, where those wronged by Granger now rested. Their vibrant colors were a living memorial, a promise of new beginnings. Hank, older now, his face a map of the landscape he loved, would sit on the porch, watching the green fields stretch towards the horizon. He saw Caleb and Anna, grown, strong, and free, racing their horses across the land, their laughter echoing. The memories of war still lingered, but they no longer haunted him. He found a quiet contentment in the rhythm of the ranch, in the silent strength of Mary beside him, in the vibrant lives of the children. His redemption wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, but a steady, persistent work, a legacy of quiet strength etched onto the land and into the hearts of the people he had fought to save. And out there, in the wild miles of silence, some men did right, not loud, but lasting.